Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Henry George School for another exciting evening with Dr. Walter Perry. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? Spending, taxation, and the human rights of the individual citizen. Dr. Perry, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ibrahima. Okay, and thank you again for helping me get these slides to work correctly. After so many occasions of having you do it for me, I'm grateful to be able to do it myself. Wait a minute, I may have spoken too soon. No, okay. The problem we're dealing with this evening is how to finance government spending when it is politically impossible to raise taxes and without a political path to cut spending to match tax receipts. We're simply going to posit that that's the current political case. I think there's pretty good evidence that it is, and we're going to work on the assumption that in the foreseeable future, there will not be the political will and majority either to raise taxes or to cut spending and balance the spending with the tax receipts. So we've got to figure out what to do instead to get out of this impasse. My analysis this evening is going to be on my computational semantics methodology. Most of you who are here have heard me speak about this on more than one occasion. It is a methodology I've been working on for decades now. It allows a proof by etiology, that is to say, we can prove what the semantics or the meaning or the value of a conclusion are by demonstrating that all the values necessary to support that conclusion have been properly realized in the specifics of the conclusion we're presenting. That is, if we say that the conclusion involves the ability to impose taxes, we have to demonstrate that historically and legally that's so. Otherwise, we can't posit that there's an ability to collect taxes without demonstrating its concrete nature. Anyway, I will present a hypothesis for what I think is a thoroughly Georgist solution to get us out of our current impasse. And I will justify that hypothesis with a semantic proof based on a historical survey of the evidence. And then I will present the proposal and let people give me their opinions and their criticisms of how I have arrived at it. All right, the semantic understanding, just to go through this very quickly, it's actually as an epistemological methodology, it's the converse of the case method or of modeling or of what is now called AI or machine learning. Instead of using a training set, or in the case of the case method in the law, a body of decided cases in order to abstract principles or classifications on which those cases were decided, and then taking all new data and subjecting it to classification by the principles abstracted from the training set. The semantic understanding recognizes when there is a new or emergent property. That is, if we have an output from a process which differs from previous outputs from the same process, we must assume that we have a mutation. We must assume we have an emergent property, and then we must expand the number of classifications, if you will, to accommodate the new emergent output which we've seen. And we can document the etiological provenance of all of the salient factors that go into the output rather than making an ontological classification of the output. The best example I know of what this means is drawn from Professor E.J. Corey's 1988 book, The Logic of Chemical Synthesis. He won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1990 based on the ideas in that book. And the notion is that a protein, protein X, is not protein X because it corresponds to the schema for protein X. That is, it is not protein X because it is ontologically classified as a noun by the schema which defines that noun. Rather, protein X is protein X because it is synthesized by the process which we define to synthesize protein X, which is to say, it is defined as a verb. Its identity is a verb, not a noun. It is etiological and not ontological. Okay, the hypothesis I'm presenting tonight is essentially the philosophical underpinnings of what I see as the Georgist community, which is that sovereignty and the definition of the polity itself could be realized by specific consent for each instance exercise of sovereign power or privilege, despite a contrary historical trend, and indeed a historical trend which has lasted for 25 centuries at a minimum. All right, I'm going to start with Warren Mosler's story of Pompeii. Mosler, as most of you know, is the father of modern monetary theory, and in fact is probably the only person who makes a cogent presentation of modern monetary theory. I find it particularly annoying that the people who are cited as the proponents or the gurus of MMT don't seem to understand Mosler's point. But he himself understands it and presents it very well. The origin story that he gives us for modern monetary theory is what he calls the story of Pompeii. And he was at the archaeological site of the city of Pompeii, which was destroyed in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in the 1st century. And the eruption of the volcano covered the city in lava and ash at the moment of greatest activity on an ordinary weekday morning, and preserved the life of the people in sometimes astonishing detail. And one of those details which caught Mosler's eye was the number of coins, which are everywhere. And the coins don't have much intrinsic value. They're base metal coins, but they've clearly been in what had been someone's pockets. They're on counters in shops. They're in drawers. He was struck by the enormous number of coins. And he asks himself the question, how does a monetary economy come together? That is, what are the necessary steps, and in what order must those steps take place in order to have a functioning monetary economy? And seeing the coins, he realizes that they were accepted as tender. And how do you get your coins accepted as tender in the first place? And even more basic a question, how do you get the coins which are going to be used as tender in circulation within your emerging monetary economy? And trying out all the possible combinations of factors and the order in which those factors must appear, Mosler concludes, and I think it's a stroke of genius the way he does conclude it, that what must come first is a tax liability. That is, there has to be a taxing authority which imposes a tax liability on the people who will participate in the economy which you are creating. Because it is only when they face that liability and the necessity to have the legal tender coins, which are required to satisfy that tax liability, that they will do what is necessary to acquire those coins. And what is necessary to acquire those coins is first that they must offer themselves uh, for employment which pays in those particular coins. And then they must offer their goods for sale in those particular coins. But neither seeking employment nor seeking to sell one's goods or one's services is possible or is incentivized before there is the necessity to acquire those coins, and that necessity can come only from a tax liability. So the fundamental starting point for Mosler and for modern monetary theory properly understood is the existence of a tax liability, which presupposes the existence of a taxing authority. So that leads us to the question of what basis is there in the law to impose that liability? So let's look at the actual situation at the time of Pompeii, and let's talk about Roman taxation in the Augustan period. Mosler's view about the role of the coins in Pompeii and the necessity of a tax liability to keep those coins in circulation may be speculation, but we don't have to speculate at all about the nature and the specifics of Roman taxation in this precise period. It is extremely well documented and historically well understood. And when Octavian, later to be known as Caesar Augustus, came to power after his defeat of Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium, that was the third civil war in 100 years in Rome. And Octavian Augustus's first priority was to prevent another civil war. There had been three of them within 4 generations. The War of Marius and Sulla, followed by the war between Caesar and Pompey, followed by the war between Octavian and Antony. And Octavian's really genius realization was that the best way to prevent civil war and to keep the loyalty of the Roman people to a single set of institutions was to restore the Republican institutions which they and their ancestors had been loyal to for, at that point, more than 500 years. So he restored in precise detail the political institutions of the Roman Republic. And the only title he took for himself was princeps, essentially first citizen. And the election of consuls, the elections of the aediles and the other curule offices of the Roman Republic went on as they had before they were disrupted by a century of successive civil wars, with one enormous exception, which wasn't really an exception at all. Having conquered the old Ptolemaic Empire, the empire in the east, with his defeat of Cleopatra, Augustus invoked the old Roman concept of victor's rights to give himself personal control of the conquered territories to the east. And quite specific to that was that Egypt was the most productive and wealthiest of those territories. And as the victor who had conquered those territories, he had the personal right to impose personal taxation on those territories in the East. And taxation was understood to include the ability to condemn, to alienate the labor of another man up to and including 100% of his labor, which is to say, enslavement. So, under the law, with his status as victor, Augustus had the personal power to set rates of taxation on the conquered subjects of the East and to set those rates at 100% in cases where he wished to see them enslaved and ultimately sold for his benefit as victor. This established at a single stroke an authority to tax rooted in ancient Roman law and custom regarding the rights of victor. And it put Augustus in the position of being personally in control of the main source of revenue to the Roman state. So that with the institutions of the Republic revived and the Senate governing through acts of the Senate and the consuls and the other curule offices being elected as they always had, it was necessary for those elected to those curule offices and for the senators in their debates to keep an eye on where the funds they appropriated for public works were to come from, because there was really only one source for the majority of those funds, which was Augustus's personal pocketbook. So he had managed at a single stroke first to reimpose the ancient institutions of the Republic, which had the loyalty of the Roman people, and second, to impose a politically immune and completely arbitrary system of taxation under his own control, through which he controlled all of the activities of the state simply because they were dependent on him for their revenues. Now, we see how that looks from the perspective of Rome. Let's take a moment and think how it looks from the perspective of the conquered people in Jerusalem. Under Jewish law, it is a first commandment violation to pay a tax other than the temple tax. The temple tax was, first of all, voluntary. We can think of it as essentially a membership dues for being enrolled as a Jew. And It was paid by those who wanted to be recognized by the temple and have their families recognized by the temple as being part of the people of Israel. But for an observant Jew, it was a violation of the first commandment to pay a tax imposed by Caesar, because that would imply that Caesar was at the very least the equal of God in being capable of commanding the honor of a Jew by virtue of his paying tribute in the form of taxation. It was also a second commandment violation because the coin, which was legal tender, in which the Roman tax had to be paid, was a Roman coin which contained a graven image of Caesar. So when the Pharisees send their man to Jesus to ask him for his legal opinion as a learned rabbi, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? The clearly settled answer in Jewish law is, of course not. It's a first commandment violation. It's a second commandment violation. And it was perfectly understood that in Jewish law, there was no provision for one man to condemn or alienate the fruit of another man's labor. But Jesus doesn't give them the answer they're looking for. Of course, they wanted to trap him into giving them the answer that no, it was not lawful to pay taxes to Caesar, because then he can be reported to the Roman authorities for sedition against Caesar and eliminated on those grounds. Or if he were to say that it was legal to pay taxes to Caesar, he could be reported to the religious authorities, to the Sanhedrin, for his blasphemous violation of the clear and well accepted understanding of Jewish law. But his answer is essentially, my kingdom is not of this world. That is, the things of God do not exist in the same realm as the things of Caesar. When he says, render unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things which are God's, he is making a distinction between two worldviews that have no nexus. And this is the first articulation in the Western Judeo-Christian tradition of the concept of the separation of church and state. They are as fundamentally separated in this understanding as they can possibly be. They are in mutually incomprehensible realms, though the significance of that will not come back for another 1,500 years. So, what is church and what is state? If we look at the 2,200 years of evidence that I'm effectively surveying in this talk, we find that the best definition of state is the aggregator of violence. That is, the state seeks, and demonstrably in the actions of the state, gathers to itself a monopoly of violence. Only the state can wage war. Only the state can exercise police powers, powers of coercion against its own people, and against anyone within its reach. The church, on the other hand, is the aggregator of consensus. And let's be very clear about this term consensus. Some of you have heard me say before that consensus is on its face a human rights violation. Consensus is what authority offers when it cannot garner consent. And consensus is effectively the polar opposite of consent. Consensus is the tyranny, in the utmost sense of that word, of the majority, or of the consensus making powers, even if they don't represent a numerical majority. And that too is the most important historical fact in the evolution of the church, of the sects, of the religions over the next 2,000 years in the Judeo-Christian Western tradition. Okay, that consolidation of both church and state reaches its next milestone with the Emperor Constantine. Constantine had been one of the four great army commanders at the time the previous emperor was overthrown and assassinated. And as had become again the fashion by the time of Constantine in the early 4th century AD, it was necessary for the commanders of the four major Roman armies to fight it out over who became the new Caesar. And Constantine had eliminated two of his rivals and faced the third at the Battle of the Mulvian Bridge in the year which we now call 317. And the which we now call 317 is important in this because of a particular power that Constantine granted. But Constantine, the night before the Battle of the Mulvian Bridge, had seen a vision in the sky of a cross with the Chi and Rho, the first letters of Christos, in it, which said, "In hoc signo vinces," in this sign you will conquer. And he swore that if he won the battle, he would make that god the chief god of the Roman state. He did, in fact, win the battle. And having won the battle, he went about trying to figure out who this god was, who spoke for him, how his edict that this was now to be the established religion of the Roman state could be carried out, and what it was that these people who call themselves followers of Christos believed. And he called a council of all of the bishops of Christianity who assembled at Nicaea and set about setting down the meanings and belief of their religion. The first thing they did was declare that the calendar should be reformed to begin with what they estimated was the year of Christ's birth. And so they declared the year in which they gathered in the Council of Nicaea to be the year 325, which is why we get into problems when we date this one way using the Christian calendar and a slightly different way using the Roman calendar, which begins from the foundation of the city of Rome in 753 BC. In any case, what they quickly discovered at the Council of Nicaea was that there were as many beliefs as there were bishops present, and probably more. And that left them with the problem of saying there is this range of beliefs which various members in various congregations of this church are shown to embrace, or to sit down and impose a single orthodoxy. And they imposed a single orthodoxy. They committed that orthodoxy to a statement of belief known in its short form as the Nicene Creed. It is, of course, backed up by reams of theological documentation. But the effect of setting down a single orthodoxy of belief was that they then had to anathematize or excommunicate those whose beliefs varied. And they had to establish essentially an official that would enforce the now established Orthodox beliefs. And it was at this point that the Bishop of Rome was given the old title of Pontifex Maximus. Pontifex is the oldest of the Roman words to describe a priest. It literally means a bridge builder. And there were bridge builders to the gods for every one of the major gods in Republican Rome. And those pontifices formed the Council of Pontiffs or Pontifices. And there was a presiding member who derived his authority from Zeus, from Jupiter, as being the highest of the gods and the most particular protector of Rome. He was known as the Pontifex Maximus, which was the title that the Bishop of Rome then took as the supreme leader, the supreme bridge builder, the holder of the magisterium from God within the Orthodox Christianity, which had been promulgated at the Council of Nicaea. Okay, let us skip ahead in looking at the development of both church and state to the Norman invasion of England. Once again, it is extremely well documented, and it is the confrontation of a traditional communal society of the sort that the so-called barbarian tribes had brought in the last years of Rome. That communal society had existed among the Angles and the Saxons in Britain, essentially since they had arrived when the Romans left. But in 1066, the Anglo-Saxon king Harold was conquered and killed by the Norman Duke William of Normandy, who became known as William the Conqueror. And William imposed on a communal society of the Anglo-Saxons the most strict form of feudalism to be found in Europe. And it's a well-documented process, and it's a case of a society being forcibly moved from one form of societal organization to almost the polar opposite form of societal organization, given what we see in surrounding societies in Europe in the 11th century. And the basis of the feudal society, which was imposed by William the Conqueror, was the documentation of the Doomsday Book. It's called the Doomsday Book because its judgments are final and absolute and will not be questioned for all eternity. And the Doomsday Book, there are actually two of them, but it was compiled ending in the year 1086 as a listing of all the real property in the realm conquered by William of Normandy, and a statement of who is the holder of that property and from whom he is subinfeudinated, if anyone. And it lays out in precise detail what the feudal obligations and the feudal holdings and the division of the feudal holdings into the personal holdings and then the sublet, sub-infeudinated holdings of each of the property holders, so that it presents in a single place the entire hierarchy of feudalism in what has now become the strictest feudal state in Europe, and the exact amount of property on which feudal lords may extract rents, taxes, impositions from those below them in the feudal chain. So it is quite literally the hierarchical presentation of the imposition of both violence and consensus. Consensus in that it states the authoritative meaning of all the property, and violence because it states the hierarchical power of one individual in the feudal chain of ownership and authority to another. All right. This is further complicated in the following century by the Crusades. And the Crusades are occasioned by the Seljuk Turks, the Seljuks, now they're the ancestors of the modern Turks, having conquered Jerusalem and imposed draconian new restrictions on who may visit the holy sites and who may enter the lands of the Muslim Caliphate. And the Pope, Boniface and Gregory of the time, took the occasion to extend both the feudal powers of the church and the taxation powers of the church, so that the feudal lords of England, the feudal lords of Europe, were put under the control of the Pope as their feudal overlord. And this was done by two methods. One of them, the institutionalization of violence in the service of violence, and the other, the imposition of rent. And first, in the feudal system, there is what is called the duty of scutage. Scutage is shield work, which means that if your overlord calls on you, he is entitled, based on the size of your feudal property, to demand a certain number of armed men from you to fight his wars. In some cases, you can pay a cash quit rent instead of supplying armed men, so that you answer the duty of scutage either by providing the men or by paying a tax, a fine, a fee, an imposition in lieu. And the Pope asserted his right to impose a duty of scutage upon the major feudal kings of Europe. And by the Third Crusade, he had enlisted the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa, the Norman King of England, Richard Lionheart, and the King of France, Philip Augustus, as his feudal liege men to lead an army against Jerusalem and take it back from the Seljuks. The second concept, which was proposed at the time of the Crusades, was the treasury of merit. And the way that works is this: the Pope was willing to offer to any man who voluntarily enlisted for the Crusades a plenary indulgence, that is, the forgiveness of all of his sins and the certainty of admission to heaven. How was the Pope empowered to do such a thing? Well, there were two ways he could have gone. He could have gone resting on the scriptural authority of whose sins you forgive, they are forgiven, and whose sins you retain, they are retained. But instead, they invented this notion of the treasury of merit, which says that since Peter holds the keys to the kingdom, he decides who gets in based on the records he keeps. And he essentially runs the property locker at the door of heaven, where you check all of your accumulated merit from your life on earth, which you no longer need because it's gotten you admitted into heaven. And as articulated over the next 2 centuries, essentially the Pope is entitled to sell that accumulated merit out of St. Peter's property locker to those who wish to purchase plenary indulgence and the certainty of admission to heaven. And the third thing that comes out of this is a remaking of the legal structure of the church, essentially to mirror what it is most afraid of in the Muslim threat. That is, as the Pope, as the church, as Westerners understood Islam, the Ummah, the collection of the Muslim people, which is both a community of faith and a political community, is empowered as a community to impose orthodoxy and to expel those who do not conform to its orthodoxy. And from that understanding of Islam, the church over the next 3 centuries configured itself through the Holy Office, the Roman Inquisition, into first the authority as to what Orthodox belief was, and second, into the enforcer of that orthodoxy, both spiritually and temporally. Although, if you ask, the church will tell you that the Inquisition never punished, let alone executed anyone. which is strictly true because courts of inquisition found heresy, blasphemy, heterodoxy, and then referred their evidence to the civil courts, which were expected to deal appropriately with those who, because they were judged by the church to be heterodox, clearly were enemies of the state. All right, so as we continue through the Middle Ages and arrive in the 13th, early 14th century toward the Renaissance, we find that in the feudal Europe, there are basically four types of taxes. There are feudal duties. That's what you owe to your feudal overlord for your fief, for the land which he has put in your control, as well as your other feudal duties, such as scutage. There is the tithe, which is what every Christian owes to the Pope, and it is 10% of his increase. That is, it's the only form of income taxation rather than wealth taxation or use tax known in medieval Europe. Then there are tariffs and tolls. If you hold a feudal manor, you are entitled to collect tariffs on goods which are brought into your feudal lands, and you are entitled to collect tolls for those who cross your lands or transit your lands for whatever purpose. And then the banals, which is the lowest form of taxation, which really apply only to the serfs and those at the lowest level of society. And these are fees you are charged for the use of land and for the use of equipment, because being a serf, you have no land and have no equipment. The feudal lord charges you banal for the use of his wine press, the use of his threshing machine, the use of his oven, and so on. All right, we arrive at Lorenzo, the first Lorenzo de' Medici, who has the idea which essentially leads to the Renaissance, because it leads to Florence becoming almost overnight the wealthiest city in Europe. And Lorenzo's idea is to get himself appointed the collection agent for the tithe. And this very quickly allows him to control, as what we would call deposits, you can think of them as a float in the Medici Bank, effectively 10% of the GDP of Europe. And during the period that he holds that money, from the time it's collected until the time it's finally paid to the Pope, he is, of course, in the business of and creates the modern business of banking, lending out those funds and using them to buy politicians and loyalty, and otherwise engaging in all of the activities that make Florence, within half a century, suddenly the richest city in Europe. Fast forward again to the beginning of the 16th century, Luther and the Wars of Religion. In 1517, Luther nails his 95 Theses, that is, 95 points which he wants to have debated with anyone who will step forward from the church. And those 95 theses are seen to be a direct attack on the authority and the legitimacy, and most important of all, the income of the Pope. And in 1521, Luther is summoned to Worms, to a diet, a council convened by the new Holy Roman Emperor, the 16-year-old Charles V, where he is tried and convicted of heresy and sentenced to death. Why wasn't Luther executed, and why didn't he disappear from history 4 years after posting his theses once he was tried by the civil authorities? The answer is that the two most powerful lords in Germany, the Duke of Brandenburg and the Elector of Saxony, looked at what Luther was proposing and realized that if there were no pope, then the 10% tithe, which worked its way up from the lowest to the highest orders of society, would stop with them. And they liked this idea very much indeed. And they protected Luther. And Europe very quickly divided into pro and anti-Lutheran camps, beginning the first round of the Wars of Religion. That round ends in 1555 with the Peace of Augsburg, where Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, concedes the main point, which is that the Pope is not the one and only authoritative voice of God on earth, that the Pope does not exclusively hold the magisterium. And the principle, which is articulated at the Peace of Augsburg, is cuius regio eius religio. That is, he who holds the power determines the belief. And the system was set up so that the various principalities of Europe, the various rulers, could choose either Roman Catholicism or Lutheranism as their official established religion. That did not take account of the rise of Calvinism during the years of the first series of wars of religion. And the wars of religion reignited, culminating in the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648. And the 30 Years' War was the most devastating war in the history of Europe. And it ends with the same principle that had been enunciated at Augsburg, cuius regio eius religio, but now there are three choices available and the possibility that down the line there might be more. This is the Peace of Westphalia, which is generally considered to be the foundation of the modern European nation state, where the ruler, the civil ruler, can decide the state religion of the people. And they were given in 1648 at least three choices: Catholicism, Lutheranism, or Calvinism. And as time went on, there were accommodations for others. But as you would imagine in such circumstances, there were a group of people who, after these two generations of wars of religion, and particularly after the 30 Years' War, came to the conclusion that there was no magisterium. There was no divine right to say what the truth is, and there was no basis for the establishment of a state religion. And in many cases, they questioned whether there was any basis for the establishment of a state. These are the separatist dissenters. They were most prominent in England and in the Netherlands in the middle of the 17th century, but they came from all over Europe, and a great many of them emigrated to North America. In North America, they become the New World Christian Zionists. They call themselves Zionists. Their specific purpose is to reestablish the organization both of belief and of state governance as it had existed before the imposition of Roman orthodoxy. Now, there are really two impositions of Roman orthodoxy. There's the one imposed by Augustus on the conquered territories of the East, and there's the one imposed by the popes on the people of the Western Empire after the Council of Nicaea. There's also the vast change of societal organization, which feudalism had imposed most specifically and best documented in England in the conversion from a communal society to a feudal society. And in North America, there was a reversion, religious-based in New England, corporate in New Netherland and in Virginia, but it was a reversion to commons and to consent as the basis of community. Whether you entered into that consent as a member of a religious congregation or as a holder of common stock and a venturer with a common stock company, as with the Virginia Company, as with the West Indies Company in New Netherland. So sometimes the community was corporate and sometimes it was prudential, but in both cases, it utterly rejected the two premises of feudalism, which were that there was a hierarchy of authority and that there was an official belief rather than the individual consent to particular practices and perhaps to the underlying beliefs. So, New World Christian Zionists, they form congregational polities. Again, some are credential, some are corporate. Effectively, no church, no state. And they describe this in 200 years of writings as the New Jerusalem. All right. Continuing again in North America, we see the attitudes toward both state power and toward the establishment of religion and the paying of the tithe, which goes along with the establishment of religion, in a couple of examples that are worth mentioning. The foundation of King's College, New York, Columbia University today, by a royal charter of George II in 1754. This created much outrage and a great deal of publication in Massachusetts, and most particularly from Harvard, on the grounds that nothing could be more un-American. Now, of course, King's College was actually the second royal chartered college. The College of William and Mary had been chartered a century earlier, almost a century earlier. But they hadn't noticed that so strongly at Harvard. But Harvard and Massachusetts' objection was that here was an institution of belief being supported by public money. being supported by the crown. And they were stuck at Harvard, dependent on the congregants of New England answering their pleas for support, and ultimately the Assembly of Massachusetts, to some extent, answering their pleas for support. But it was necessary for them to suit the wants and needs of the congregations which depended on Harvard to train its clergy, and therefore depended on Harvard to maintain proper beliefs and disavow others, whereas King's College was a direct agent of the crown, that it was paid to teach what it didn't have to persuade the people of New York that they should want taught, that they should want believed, that they should want supported by public money. All right. Then there's the tea monopoly, of course, which we all know about from the Bostonians ultimately dumping the taxed tea into Boston Harbor. But of course, the king saw an opportunity to grant a monopoly on the importation of tea to America to the West Indies Company. And he got a 15% rake off on the price of tea and imposed a 15% tariff on those who were given no choice if they wanted tea but to buy the tea from the West Indies Company. This, of course, outraged Boston, whose leading citizen, John Hancock, had become arguably the richest man in town by virtue of being the most successful importer of untaxed goods. And once the tariff was in place, becoming quite overtly the most successful smuggler. But again, the notion that these North Americans had never had a tariff imposed upon them, and they had never been restricted in their goods by a monopoly. And these were outrages and overreach by the crown. Thomas Jefferson's Virginia Statute on Religious Liberties. He drafted it immediately after the Declaration of Independence in 1776, but because of the disruption of the ensuing war, it wasn't actually enacted by the Virginia legislature for 10 years. But during that time, it circulated among his correspondence. And the general opinion about the disestablishment of the Church of England was, well, who's going to pay for the soup kitchens and who's going to pay for the orphanages? If we don't impose the tithe on everyone, whether they profess to be Church of England or not, simply because Church of England, being the established church in Virginia, had therefore the right to collect the tithe. If we make it voluntary, what happens if it doesn't raise enough revenue? And Jefferson's answer was, it raises as much revenue as people think is correct. And if the people are as good as they would like to be, they will raise the necessary revenue. But if they think the revenue is not necessary for those purposes to which it will be put, they will not raise it. And then we come to a contentious point, what I view as the constitutional prohibitions on the aggregation of either violence or consensus. I'm not going to go into that very deeply because I think it will require a complete separate talk to discuss what the Second Amendment actually means, and what the Fourth Amendment actually means. So for the moment, I'm going to leave that aside and move on to the 19th century and the rise of the Bismarckian nation state. After the Napoleonic Wars and after the redivision of Europe at the Congress of Vienna, effectively a redo of the Peace of Westphalia to try to make boundaries and powers permanent after they've been disrupted by Napoleon. But more importantly, in the case of the Bismarckian state, after 1848 and the socialist uprisings all over continental Europe, it was quite clear to Bismarck, as to the other nation builders of the time, that the only way you could avoid Marxism was to do better at it than the Marxist would. And if the state became the ultimate regulator, the ultimate guarantor of the quality of life of the people, then the people would have no reason to turn to Marxism. And Bismarck was the most successful in the European nation builders of the second half of the 19th century. But he was hardly alone, certainly Garibaldi, and to a large extent Napoleon III, although Napoleon III mixed it up with some specifically French customs. But then, of course, the most successful of the Bismarckian nation state builders was Lincoln. And Lincoln built the nation state. And if there's any doubt about this, you need only read Karl Marx's articles, either the 11 years that he wrote for the New York Telegram of editorials pointing out what the nation state that emerged from the end of the Union would be, or the reports he wrote for the London papers during the American Civil War, the war between the states, in which Lincoln emerges as Marx's ideal leader. In any case, the Bismarckian nation state has a monopoly on both violence and consensus. It says what the official opinion of the state is on all matters of both politics and morals, and it backs that up with a monopoly on violence. Only it controls the army, only it controls the police. It raises revenue by coercion, the imposition of taxes in the Roman manner, and it appropriates spending by consensus, which is to say, instead of the communitarian world of early American settlement, there is a governing body which, through its own mechanisms, appropriates the spending of the revenues raised by coercion. And finally, we come to disestablishment. And the best way to understand exactly what disestablishment is to look at the Statute of Disestablishment, the British Statute of Disestablishment of 1868, which disestablished the Anglican Church as the official church in Ireland. There's a great deal of well-documented argument on this subject, but the idea was that one side made the argument that the Irish would not, or perhaps could not, pay what was necessary for the social services that were afforded them by the tithe. And if the tithe was removed and if the Church of England was disestablished, then social services in Ireland would disappear. That's still an open subject in Irish as well as British politics. But the Act of Disestablishment specifically halts the state imposition and the collection of the tithe. By contrast, there's the current system still in effect in Germany where the state collects the tithe and you register with the state as part of a denomination, and the state collects the tithe from you on behalf of the denomination you're registered with, unless, of course, your denomination is illegal in Germany. And there is still a active litigation on that subject regarding the Church of Scientology. Germany takes the position that the Church of Scientology, being a cult of personality, violates the denazification laws and cannot be recognized as a religion. And the United States continues to press a human rights case against Germany on that very subject, claiming that Germany cannot discriminate against a religion which has been found to be a religion by the Supreme Court of the United States. And of course, whatever you think about Scientology, you have to give them credit that having been denied status as a religion by the Internal Revenue Service, you know, the modern Inquisition, the Holy Office, which decides what is and is not an article of proper belief. But in 1956, the United States Supreme Court ruled that Scientology met the criteria and must be treated as a religion. And in light of that decision, the United States continues to press a human rights matter against Germany for denying them recognition as a religion. So you see, disestablishment is not something that just happened in the 19th century and is long in the past. All right, we come to the proposal. Suppose we return to the communitarian ideal. And suppose in the particular, let's call it Georgist community, the community holds the land in trust. That is, the individual members of the community must license the usufruct of the land from the community as a whole, from the community as an entity. And the community as an entity decides all use of the proceeds of those licenses of usufruct. The community functions by consent, not by consensus. Where there is not unanimous consent, ultimately the dissenter must willingly accept the opinion of the majority, the opinion of everyone except himself as to how the community is governed, or he must withdraw, which is the same as in corporate law or in the case of a religious congregation. Again, as in the early American experiment, there's no real distinction in the nature of a communitarian society, whether those communities are credential or whether they're corporate. And of course, the community itself legitimately raises its revenue and legitimately appropriates the proceeds by the inherent right of its members to decide their own both credential and economic needs and commitments. Okay, I've gone on long enough. Let me stop sharing here. And okay, there you are.
So you are ready for questions?
I'm ready for questions.
All right. So, Marty, you got something to add, comments or questions?
Uh, yeah, I was writing down all my notes. Maybe but I guess I haven't formulated a question that focuses on the ultimate conclusion that Walter comes to. I guess what I see that you've traced history to the point of stating the logical makeup of a Georgist legal framework, and I suppose that would help us to do that. I guess I was a little curious about the phase of Marx's life where he saw Lincoln as the ideal leader. Was that consistent with his conclusion later in Capital?
This is separate. I mean, these are really fascinating articles to read. He was writing them for the London newspapers. He would go down to the dock and get the American newspapers. He would write a quick summary of the week's battles. And then he would surround it with a larger encomium as to why Lincoln was really pointing the way out of, I'm not sure if I want to call it exploitation, but anyway, you can read them. The interesting thing is to see their effect on Stalin. And if you read Giorgio Agamben, the Italian historian, particularly a work of his called State of Exception, his central thesis is that Stalin is a creature of Marx's interpretation of Lincoln, that Stalin's notion of the new Soviet man and the fact that Stalin was a true believer led him to understand that Lincoln simply has to use the force of the state to eradicate heretical opinion. And this leads in all sorts of terrible ways with Stalin. I mean, it leads to Lysenko. I mean, Lysenko was Stalin's favorite scientist precisely because he seemed to validate the idea that you can create a new Soviet man. It might take a great deal of energy and violence to do it. But Lysenko, set back biology in the Soviet Union by 2 generations because of his notion that imposed characteristics could be heritable. And of course, they aren't. And his engineered wheat was directly responsible for the Ukrainian famine in 36 and 37. Lysenko probably killed 5 million people through famine, and the ideological failure of his Soviet correct plant engineering. But Stalin never lost faith in Lysenko. And it's an interesting way to see how the leader who can remake human nature, as Marx ultimately came to think Lincoln could. And Stalin realized that that was what he would have to do, becomes the source of, the horrors of the 30s.
Yeah, it's hardly a Marxist theory, I suppose. It's really something that's kind of like a one-off on Marx's writings. That's all I had. Thanks.
Joe? Joe's got his hand up.
Thanks for that, Dr. Perry. A long time ago, I took a course with Marshall McLuhan, and you kind of remind me of him. He was
I knew him.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
Where did you know him from?
I met him in New York, actually, at Columbia. And,
Okay. Good.
but it was before he lost his mind, and unfortunately, people did not understand that it was Alzheimer's. They thought he was actually that terrible in person.
Oh, no, I would say he was pretty young when he died. I'm not sure if he was even 70. He had some strokes, and that eventually took him. At any rate, he I do see a commonality. He had his doctorate in literature, and that became a launching pad for an exploration of a far bigger universe. He got involved in economics with the Canadian economist Harold Innis. He got involved with anthropologists and sociologists and historians. And your launching pad has been the classics, and you've gotten involved in economics, obviously, and business, and it becomes a launching pad to far more.
I tried to move in the late 80s, early 90s into semantics, precisely because I was having to deal with syntaxes that should have done the same things they did in classical languages, but weren't understood that way.
Yeah.
Economics is one of them. Genomics is one of them. And, again, most of my day-to-day work now is in genomics, simply because the data tools that most researchers use are not capable of capturing the kinetic effects of their very expensive experiments. So they make the same mistakes over and over and over again, and they miss the emergent properties over and over and over again.
Yeah. And like him, that wealth of information takes your audience into quite an adventure. He had also a remarkable vocabulary and memory like you do. And that meant he could accumulate all of that material and share with his audience. But the disadvantage of that, of course, is that the audience can only envy that talent and has difficulty matching the perceptions. But my question for you is, because of the title of this particular lecture, is can you connect for us all that remarkable history to the title of the lecture for us? We're not as good at making all these, connecting all the dots. So could you kind of succinctly do that for us? Thank you.
It is not lawful to pay taxes to Caesar, as any observant Jew would have told you at any time from the Second Temple until at least the 19th century. So if it is not lawful to pay taxes to Caesar, how do we create a just community, which does not require either a monopoly of violence or a monopoly of consensus. That is, it does not have to be the sole source of force, ultimately against its own people, and it does not have to be the sole source of truth.
Okay, so then the next connection would be your introductory comment about the fact that currently we're in a situation where one side is unwilling to raise taxes. They've consistently lowered taxes since 1980 over and over and over again. And the other side is unwilling to cut spending. Although the spending by both sides has pretty much been the same all that during that time. So how does
an impasse?
So how do this is the impasse you described. So how does the Georgian approach address that impasse? How do we fix that with a Georgist? One, off the top of my head, I would say one side is a better taxation system, land values, so forth. And one of our attendees here, Richard Demare, would say we would add a statewide version of that with an income tax, apply capturing unearned income with our income tax system, and as well. And the other thing off the top of my head would be the use of the greenback approach, where the state exercises its constitutional power to issue money and bypasses the rentier activity, the fundamental rentier activity of the banking system, which has somehow privatized that power and thereby has taxed the people involuntarily, to use your description. So what is your analysis of how the Georgian theories would address the impasse? That's my question. Thanks.
All right, I want to take us away from the monetarist focus of the question, because what we're really talking about is how do we achieve a just community? And it becomes clear that that community cannot assert either a monopoly of violence or a monopoly of belief. And therefore, it cannot assert the defining characteristic of the state or the defining characteristic of the church. Instead of separating church and state, we are eliminating both in favor of community governed by consent. And the reason we don't want to substitute a monetarist approach is that, first of all, that creates state power, where what we're trying to do here is eliminate state power, because state power leads, as we have seen through 2,200 years of history, inevitably to a monopoly of violence and a monopoly of belief. And on the specific question of the power of the state to issue money, there is no case where that money does not become fraudulent, as it certainly is in the United States at the moment. I mean, the reason that rates are kept where they are at the moment by the Fed is so that they don't destroy either of the two systemically important clients of government monetary policy. But the deeper reason is that the government can borrow for less than the true devaluation rate of the money. And so long as they can do that, they can buy votes, not just by preserving the systemically important financial institutions in society, but by directing money to uneconomic, unsustainable, uncreditworthy endeavors of all sort, because there's no short-term consequence. And the long-term consequence is quite certainly the collapse of that particular currency long after those politicians are out of office.
Okay, so you mentioned borrowing at a sub-realistic rate. As I understand it, Lincoln was faced with impossible rates at the beginning of the Civil War, and that's why they turned to greenbacks, which again I say is constitutional.
Oh, sure.
And
But Lincoln's the bad guy here. Lincoln's the guy who builds the Bismarckian nation state with the monopoly on violence and the monopoly on belief.
well, I'm just thinking of it. I'm just moving on to Henry George here. Henry George supported that mechanism, that model of creating interest-free money to mobilize the resources of the state.
No, I understand. The circumstances now are different. And when I say it's a Georgist answer, it's how do we create a just community which is capable of managing both its income and its expenses without finding itself where we are politically now, in the stalemate between the two sides and the effective spending down of the inherent book value of the nation, if you will. I mean, at the end of the Jimmy Carter administration, the book value of the United States had been written down to zero. And it was on that assumption that Volcker proceeded to recapitalize the country from scratch. And I suspect we're going to see the same thing at the end of the Biden regime.
Well, let me try this from a different angle. You went back to the Romans. I'll go back to the Greeks, who I think established money before the Romans did. And a gentleman by the name of Aristotle, and I think Plato supported this. He said that money was a creature of the law. It's how we organize ourselves. And a constitution, for example, is how we organize ourselves. Our legal system is how we organize ourselves. You have great credentials. That's part of the organization. It makes you authentic, validates. It could be a surgeon, mechanic, anybody. We have lots of pieces of paper that help to organize society. Money is one of them, and it controls purchasing power, control of resources. So couldn't we adapt Aristotle's vision of the state using an appropriate amount of interest-free money to help organize the nation? And and ultimately, all they're organizing is the real resources, the land, labor, and capital. The money is just a legal authorization of that organization.
Aristotle is a bad guy here too.
Oh.
No,
You're killing all my heroes.
You read Karl Popper, The Open Society and Its Enemies. It's the classic work on what's wrong with Platonism. Anyway,
Yeah.
let me call on Peter. He's got his hand up. And
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff.
Yes, hi, Dr. Perry. So, my question is, if you could just discuss briefly the function of taxes throughout history, let's just say in antiquity, generally speaking, in antiquity versus the feudal era versus the modern era, let's say the last couple of 100 years since capitalism kicked in.
Well, in Augustan Rome, where we started, there's no question that taxation and enslavement, they're the same thing. It's just a question of whether you impose a 10, 20, 30% impairment on your fellow man's labor or 100% impairment on your fellow man's labor. But the purpose of taxes in Augustan Rome was the glory of Caesar Augustus and no other. It was collected not for any purpose other than to fulfill his rights as victor, to take from the conquered up to and including everything, which is to say enslavement.
So just for clarity, things like roads in Rome, were the roads built with, say, tax revenue, and also weren't slaves also owned privately?
Yes, the first question is that's precisely why Augustus restored the institutions of the Republic. The Republic had fallen apart based on who has to pay for it and what's the money going to be used for.
Mm-hmm.
And there were 3 civil wars in 100 years. The war between Marius and Sulla, the war between Caesar and Pompey, and then the war between Octavian and Antony. And Augustus realized that what to spend the money on cannot be a political issue, but it has to be decided by ostensibly political means. So the Senate goes through the motions, and the magistrates, the curule officers, go through the motions, but they know full well that the only money they're going to be able to appropriate is what Augustus is going to give them, because he's the only significant source of revenue in the whole system.
Mm-hmm.
And that was his solution for how not to arrive where the US Congress is today. But you later get, under the medieval church, the tithe. And the purpose of the tithe is to do good works. And it's paid because, of course, you believe in what the church regards as good works, because otherwise you wouldn't be in communion with the church. You would have been eliminated by the Inquisition.
But if you don't mind, let me interrupt because
Sure.
I don't want the class to end before I get to ask you all my questions. So, I mean, the tithe is one thing, but I mean, wouldn't you consider just the kind of feudal rents that were extracted by the lords and so forth a form of taxation? I mean,
Well, of course.
right.
Course.
So okay, good. Yeah. Just
I mean, when I listed the forms of taxation in the medieval world, feudal duties were right at the top of the list.
Yeah.
And the tithe was number 2.
Yeah. Okay. Great. And then in the modern era, you could go to Lincoln if you will, and from Lincoln on, if you want to. What are the functions of taxes in the modern era, and of course, including today?
Well, they don't have any.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we've learned from MMT. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, in a properly functioning economy, as MMT describes it, the function of taxes is essentially to control unemployment.
Mm-hmm.
But the initial function of taxes, as Mosler clearly understood, is to create a monetary society, because nobody needs to use your currency and nobody needs to accept your currency unless you have first imposed a tax obligation which they can satisfy only with your currency.
Right. And so that ultimate power in the modern era is sort of kind of really gelled under Lincoln, I guess. Would that be fair to say?
No, I won't give him that much credit.
Okay,
But since the Second World War, yes.
right, okay. Yep. Okay, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Marty?
Yeah, I guess an observation and question. So I observed in previous talks or comments that you've made that that Lincoln was you linked Bismarck with Lincoln, and then identified that as being a bad guy. But in previous talks, you've identified I don't think you came out and you said that the freeing of the slaves was a bad thing, but I think you put it in terms of the constitutional system that was changed in that giving freedom to the formerly enslaved. So that was the observation. Maybe you can talk about it. But then my question had to do with the ideal that you seem to point to at the end of your talk about a Georgist system where there was low violence and that it seems as though that what you're identifying is a system that might work, but as long as there's 1, 2, or 3 other strong world powers that are still bent on violence, it's kind of hard for that Georgist ideal society to be created. So could you talk about both of those ideas?
Yeah, the American blessing has always been understood as the luxury of isolation behind our 2 oceans. And it is still in the modern world inconceivable that the United States itself would be invaded. Now, you've got to close the border, of course. Otherwise, you're talking about an invasion that looks like what we could call the Viking invasion of the Anglo-Saxon world or the Celtic world in Britain and Ireland, in the 8th century, 9th century. They just come in and their society is completely different. But given that American exceptionalism is based on the great blessing of isolation behind the 2 oceans, we have a unique opportunity in history. We have had for 400 years a unique opportunity to build just communities that need not resort either to violence or monopoly on belief in order to attract their members and to nourish their members in a just and flourishing economy. I mean, the freest place on earth in 1640 was right here in New Amsterdam. And I've been doing a lot of work on this for the 400th anniversary. But, my own people came here from all over Europe because it was the only place that was safe for Protestants and Jews. It was the only place that was safe from the Inquisition. And the fact that the New Netherlands community was corporate, technically, and the Virginia community was corporate, technically, whereas the New England communities were congregational, technically, doesn't make a lot of difference when your community is limited to people who, by personal consent, join in the joint enterprise.
So, okay, so you with that comment, you address both of those perspectives.
Well, I mean, what do we have to fear from the outside?
Mhm.
It's always been from the inside. You know, I mean, the revolution is a civil war by any reasonable understanding of what a civil war is. I mean, until the very last year, Washington never enjoyed more than 40% popular support. And there was no geographic division between the loyalists and the patriots, as opposed to what we call a civil war, which wasn't a civil war at all. Two geographically distinct nations fighting over a border and over their very separate rights to self-determination. You know, which is why it's ironic, if not infuriating, to see Putin using the exact language of Lincoln. You know, they're never been a separate people. You know, their so-called government is a sham. They've never existed without us. They can't be treated as having a separate interest from us.
So maybe my last comment would be that the way that you've envisioned or described the Georgist movement, so to speak, is pretty radical and revolutionary. And I'm not too sure too many who follow our ideas or our courses and lectures would really understand the level of revolutionary uh, organization that's required, or just understanding what it is that what we're about, I suppose, might be the simplest way of saying it. That
You're right, of course, about perception. It's simply that it worked, and it worked right here in New Amsterdam better than it's ever worked anywhere in Western history.
okay? So, and you're saying that that was an expression of what is the core beliefs that a Georgist might have.
Or I would hope that they could be persuaded was the essence of Georgism. There's another way to go about it. I can do a different talk on how we can reform the current Congress to achieve some of the same communitarian goals, but this one is philosophically a great deal more appealing.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Yeah. Okay, Ibrahim, are we running out of time here, or?
Well, we are already 18 minutes past the time, but I guess we can take one last question from Joe and call it a night.
Thank you. I too have an observation and a question. Observation is that this consensus value that you've eloquently conveyed in many ways was not operative for the slaves in the United States, and Lincoln was taking that or giving them some consensus. He was giving them some freedom. That would be my observation. So I don't see him as the bad. I don't see him as the bad guy. But my question is,
Joe,
is
let's be careful about the difference between consent and consensus. They're the polar opposites.
Okay, I'll say
Yeah,
consent.
I mean,
You're right. I should.
Consensus is the tyranny of the majority, or
Yeah.
the tyranny of the authority.
Right. You're right. I should have used the word consent. And he restored consent to those people. So I don't see him as the bad guy. But my question is it fair to describe your primary intellectual philosophy, in at least in this discussion in the last couple of lectures you've given, Would it be fair to describe it as a kind of a radical libertarianism?
No.
Okay.
It's radical Judaism.
Okay.
But that involves a fundamental understanding of the distinction between the Romans and the Jews. The Romans, their entire legal system and political system, economic system is based on there is a single authoritative, correct way to proceed. And in the Jewish tradition, the point is that no idea has authority. And the point is to keep the debate going so that the debate produces the most robust, the most valid, the best argued contending ideas. But there never comes the final vote. There never comes the time when one has to prevail and the others are discarded.
Okay. Thank you.
Mhm. Okay, Ibrahima, are we wrapping it up?
Yes, I
Okay,
guess
thank you. Thank you very much. Now I've mastered a whole new trick with my with my Zoom.
The Zoom, yeah, you become expert at it in one lecture.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming tonight, and we hope to see you soon on Zoom again for our next class, which is Monday with MMT with Jim Keenan. Good night.